Few countries in the modern era have been shaped by or subject to the horrors of war as much as Poland. From its emergence after the First World War in 1918 until 20 years later, it found itself again subject to occupation. The army has played a key role in Poland's history and development. In this series of films, we look at that time, the emergence of a new army in 1918, its first major conflict in the Polish-Soviet War, its attempts during the 1930s to maintain development faced with a European-wide arms race and the struggle of the Second World War. This is a story of how the Polish army and the Navy and the Air Force responded to that challenge. In 1918, at the end of the First World War, Poland, of course, emerged as a newly independent country after 123 years of partition and immediately had to start fighting to establish its new borders. What sort of equipment at that time was available to the Polish army?
Wojsko polskie, które powstało w 1918 roku, było tworzone z kilku.
The Polish army, which was founded in 1918, was created by merging several other units. They were mainly soldiers who served in the partitioning armies, but also Polish soldiers who, from 1914, fought in the Polish legions of Józef Piłsudski. The legions initially fought alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, but later, after the Oath Crisis, they were dissolved, while Józef Piłsudski also prepared a Polish military organization, which, with underground methods, fought with the occupiers, and it was one of those two sources, and also the Poles who fought in the partitioning armies returned to the country and joined the Polish army. The army was created from these various factions. It must also be said that in 1917 a Polish army was established in France, which arrived in 1919 and supported the fight for the border. Indeed, the beginning of our statehood is fighting, initially against Ukraine, then against Germany, the Greater Poland Uprising, but also in January 1919, a battle with the Czechs breaks out, a very short-lived one. Later, the Polish Bolshevik War begins. The armament of the Polish army came from various sources. Let us remember that there were no arms factories in Poland, so it was one of the main sources, but later, as the state was somewhat solid, the Poles resorted to importing weapons that remained in the West from the demobilization after the First World War. The Blue Army even brought tanks that served in the Polish Bolshevik War. We also had the support of sympathetic Americans who sent their pilots, the famous Kościuszko Squadron, who fought in the Polish Bolshevik War. They deserved to fight the Soviet mounted army. They were American pilots who came to us from overseas. The weapons were comparable to weapons used by all European powers. These weapons were, above all, of course, the basic weapons of a soldier at that time: rifles, heavy machine guns, cannons of various types, armored trains, just to name a few. We were in the midst of creating our own arms industry. It is worth saying that during the 1920 war conditions, only grenades were produced in Poland. The rest of the weapons used by Poles were imported. The creation of a large-scale arms industry only began after the borders were established in 1922.
Szeroką skalę zaczęliśmy tworzyć dopiero po ustaleniu granic w 1922 roku.
It was complicated because in the face of the Polish Bolshevik War, Germans and Czechs did not let in armed transport, and even if Poles managed to buy weapons in the West, they had to be delivered to Poland. It so happened that during the Polish Bolshevik War, the Hungarians helped us and sent us ammunition, which was used to fight the Red Army.
And how long did it take Poland to develop its own ammunition and weapons manufacturing?
To już po zakończeniu wojny decyzją mocarstw.
It was after the Versailles Treaty that the equipment of the Gdańsk rifle factory, the German rifle factory, was handed over to Poland. A rifle factory was opened in Poland and the first rifles were mass-produced. They were Mauser rifles, modeled after German ones, because Poles finally had the opportunity to acquire this factory and create the standard armament of the Polish army. The Mauser rifles, the same as in the German army. They were modified and subjected to improvement by the Polish defense industry, and after a few years their own rifles were developed, known as the 1929 model rifle. Later, the arms industry was expanded and arms factories were created, for example the weapons factory in Radom, which also produced these rifles, and later the famous Polish pistol designed by Polish engineers. Returning to the Warsaw factory, other weapons were also produced there. Later, in the interwar period, the production of manual machine guns and heavy machine guns began. Other industries were also developed. The aviation industry was developed, planes were built, and tanks were built.
Budowano samoloty, budowano też czołgi.
So one of the major conflicts in the early years was, of course, in 1920, the Bolshevik-Polish War. And I was wondering if you could say a few words about how the equipment available to the Polish armed forces compared to that available to the Soviet forces.
Wojna polsko-bolszewicka, największa wojna, która
The Polish-Bolshevik War, the largest war that saved our independence, differed from the First World War in that it was conducted in quite large spaces with relatively small forces. Both Poles and the Russians made extensive use of their respective cavalry. The front moved very quickly. Poles managed to take Kiev, and the Russians, after a counter-offensive, approached Warsaw. Then the Poles had to take back the area occupied by the enemy. The armament was comparable. Here we can say that everything that was used in the First World War was also used in the Polish-Bolshevik War. One thing that the Russians introduced were carts that were pulled by several horses on which a machine gun was mounted. Their cavalry used this equipment, and this element of armament was taken over by Poles and used by the Polish army. Polish cavalry learned from the Bolsheviks to fight with these carts and used them to transport heavy machine guns and medium machine guns. Poles also used planes, including what I mentioned about the Kościuszko squadron. They were of course imported planes. Radio counterintelligence was a very important tactic during the Polish-Bolshevik War. We managed to organize radio counterintelligence aimed at listening to the Soviet messages and breaking the ciphers that the Russians use. During the decisive time of the Polish-Bolshevik War, the Polish command, apart from having information from prisoners and their own reconnaissance, also had information from the Red Army headquarters. All orders were made by Marshal Piłsudski, the commander-in-chief of the Polish army, and knew perfectly well what assumptions and directions of the attack the Red Army would lead, and his moves during the Warsaw Battle, or later the Battle of the Niemen River. He used this information to beat the enemy, and, thanks to the fact that we knew our opponent's grouping and their intentions, we could also disrupt the opponent's communication using the intelligence radio.
Radiowywiadu też dezorganizować łączność przeciwnika.
And about that, at that time, what sort of size was the Polish army?
Polska armia liczyła w tym czasie około miliona.
The Polish army had about 1 million soldiers at that time. It was very much during the Polish-Bolshevik War or the Battle of Warsaw. This is because the whole society mobilized and there were many volunteers who came to the army to defend their newly regained independence. It was a force comparable to the Red Army, engaged here on the front of the fight with Poland.
Tutaj na froncie walk z Polską.
Okay. And what proportion of that was cavalry?
Kawaleria w tym czasie tutaj zarówno po stronie polskiej, jak
The cavalry at this time, both on the Polish and Soviet side, played a large role, but it was not the basic type of weapon. The basic type of weapon were the ground troops supported by artillery. The cavalry, considering that the army was occupying large spaces and could achieve significant successes because of this army, in relation to what was used on a similar front during the First World War by the fighting countries, was much smaller.
Przez państwa walczące było dużo mniej.
In these programs we've seen how Poland, from its emergence in 1918, after 123 years of partition, has, as a state, had to fight for its place in Europe. the army and the other services have constantly grappled with the need for new technology against an ever-changing European political and military background. This fight for technology is one thing, but in Poland there was also a fight, a real fight, against real enemies. And despite their material defects of never quite being ready, of never quite having enough equipment, the Polish military spirit was undimmed. This was clearest of all in the Second World War, when Poland contributed to two particular events, the battle at Monte Cassino and the contribution to the Battle of Britain. Those just two out of every major theatre in which the Polish army took part. This has been a fascinating story of an undimmed military spirit fighting against all the odds. A great story. I'm Nicholas Richardson, and join me again on Poland Daily History when we delve into some more exciting aspects of Poland's history.